Hello, and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers, and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back, and enjoy. Today I'm talking to the Melbourne-based Aussie author of two novels. Her latest, The Wolf Hour, was published by Allen and Unwin in 2018. Set in Africa against the backdrop of a war-torn Uganda and its band of child soldiers, The Wolf Hour is a gripping contemporary story about the lengths a family will go to save one of their own and the uncomfortable self-truth that people inevitably must face in moments of crisis. I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Myles to the podcast. Hello, Sarah.
Hi, Claudine. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
You've captured the essence of the African landscape so incredibly well in this novel, but your writing is not only a tribute to the place and to the land, but to the people who inhabit it, their beliefs, customs and rituals. Tell me, how is it that you were able to write so authentically?
Oh, look, it was a labour of love. It was sort of something that I really, in terms of the research, I think there were two sort of major parts of it, that really intense interest of going into it. I've always had a lifelong interest in Africa. And then there was a spark that started this story, which took me there. So I've travelled there, and then I sort of did that really deep sort of research into both the history and then through that and the travel, met people, and was able to sort of go a bit further into it. So the landscape is so transporting and so contrasting to Australia, and yet there are also sort of similarities, and there's that, and then there's the people in the landscape. So that was an integral part of the setting for the novel. But it's the culture within the landscape that I was really sort of very intrigued in, and the history, both the colonial history, of which, being Australians too with a colonial history, we are a part of. So that drew me in and really interested me as well. So I think that it was sort of coming from a place of deep interest.
Okay, yeah. So, obviously I've read the book and I loved it, but for the benefit of those people who haven't read it, could you tell us a little bit more about The Wolf Hour?
Yes, so it's a moral thriller that's set partly in Australia and partly in Africa, and it concerns a family in crisis. So my central character, Tessa, is a young researcher who goes to Uganda to work with war-affected children. And she oversteps the mark in some ways, partly through her own naivety, and then draws her family into her dilemma. So there's the story of what happens to Tessa, and then there's the story of what happens within her family.
Yeah. Now, this isn't a light-hearted read by any stretch of the imagination. I think you've touched on a number of quite serious issues, and you've highlighted the fractures that exist in African society, things like the political tensions, corruption, violence, and in particular the abduction of children from their homes to serve as soldiers in the rebel forces of the Lord's Resistance Army. Now, can you tell me a little bit more about what exactly inspired you to write this particular story?
What inspired me, it came from just a small chance meeting, really, some years ago. I met a couple who were telling me about their daughter who had done a PhD in war affected children and had gone to Africa. So that was the sort of the lead in. But with them, there was their sort of pride and anxiety and concern for their daughter. And at the same time, I think I was myself very interested in notions of child exploitation, the fact that it is a worldwide problem, that this goes on, that we watch these things on the news or we read about them. So I was drawn sort of deeper into that component of the story. And then I started to think about Tessa and her family and create the character of her brother. So he sort of is completely in juxtaposition to her, and this notion that we can have siblings who are very divergent from ourselves. And that then sort of evolved into sort of broadening the story out, and I got very sort of interested in their characters. And I think that was the thing that that is the thing that really intrigues me about writing, is that our characters sort of who we are informs our decisions. So a person who is in a situation might do one thing, you might do another. So this was sort of informing all that sort of filling up stage of the novel before I really sort of got down and started to sort of think about giving it more of a sort of a narrative form.
So did you ever meet anyone like Tessa?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I think with when we write, characters are often compilations of all sorts of things, whether it's people that we've known, other people that we've read about, people that you meet vicariously or know intimately, and it's kind of, that bowerbird thing of taking different things, but then they have to have a sort of a consistency about them. And I sort of saw Tessa, she's 30, she's wiry, she's fit, she's book smart, but she's quite naive. She's also a little bit impatient, maybe a bit self-deluding, but well-meaning. She's educated, but she's still got a lot to learn. So it's her sort of innocence giving way to experience in some way. So I sort of saw her as this complex young woman who's learning about the world, who's deeply troubled by problems that can't be fixed and is trying to grapple with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say, you've described Tessa as naive in a couple of your comments, and I was going to say that she comes across as quite an idealist, and she's inherently a do-gooder, although very naive. And I guess I wanted to ask you, was this intentional on your part?
It was intentional, yes. It was. There's the component of her that, like her brother, who calls a spade, considers her a bleeding heart liberal and so forth. But I think that there is a reality. I wanted to find the veracity of Tess, who is somebody who does have these good intentions, but is learning and is a bit mixed. And through the writing of it, like she surprised me at times and did some, amazing things. And then other times, you think, and then I think, well, don't scalp her just yet, just, and so it's this thing that it's life's experiences and what it does to us. And also if you do take a risk, she's going out of the comfort zone of her own life into a world that she knows a bit about but not enough about, and she makes assumptions, some correctly, others not. But she's also very moved by the encounters that she has, both with Dominic, who's sort of like she meets him at the rehabilitation centre, and he is like a teacher, a guiding figure, and the social worker there, Beatrice, but also the one of the child soldiers who she becomes very concerned for and moved by his story. So there's that journey that she has, and that change in her through the arc of the narrative, which is really just over a small period of her life. So we just sort of see this window into her life at that time as she's growing.
Yeah, indeed. Now, there's much commentary in the novel about the perception of Westerners, especially Western aid workers in Africa, and I think you explore the tension between what the Western world believes their role is in such war-torn areas such as Uganda and what organisations such as the LRA think. At one point in the novel, there's quite an eye-opening discussion between Tessa as the main protagonist and a Colonel Colo in the latter half of the novel. And I think it's one that might apply equally to any war-torn country in which the West has a presence or sends foreign aid. A resentment of the lingering effects of colonialism, perhaps.
Yes, yeah, I think that's there, but I think it's also very real. I was very sort of, interested even just in sort of things that are aside from the war and the complexities of the Civil War and how the West has been sort of involved in that, is also sort of something like, say, arms trafficking, for example, that would provide that. And if you sort of think about that, I mean, the West has had a deep involvement, Firearms were first brought to the Kingdom of Congo in the 15th century. The biggest arms dealers now are the US, the UK, Russia, France, and China. And they're also members of the UN Security Council. And we even have Australia in our own way. I mean, we're in the top 20 currently making of weapons production. And there has been a push recently to be in the top 10. So those sorts of things, while they're not in the novel at all, they do inform this fact that we do live in very much a global world where there are global politics going on, and it does have a domino effect. There is involvement at all levels.
Yeah. Well, of course, the backdrop to this novel is very factual. I mean, it surprised me to learn just how much factual detail was in your novel. The warlord Joseph Kony was indeed responsible for the mass abduction of Ugandan children from their homes to fight for his Lord Resistance Army. And what Tessa witnesses actually happened to many children in Uganda. We learn about the atrocities the children committed through Tessa's relationship with Francis. So I wanted to know what specific research did you have to do to get such a rich factual background to your novel?
Well, as I sort of said before, I began with reading extensively. So I read hundreds of testimonials and also the kinds of PhDs that Tessa may have done. And then I did sort of interviews and travelled there and met people. So that then informed the narrative. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of sort of wonderful people who are very generous in telling their stories. So that was really what I drew heavily from in the narratives of the child soldiers.
Yeah, although I'd heard of the child soldiers of Uganda before and knew of the atrocities they were forced to commit under such a cruel regime, it's still quite shocking to read about. And I'm sure an account that many Australians would be horrified to learn about.
We are. I mean, violence is horrible, and civil war is horrible, and yet it's one of those sort of life's realities. And even though we sort of think that we're separate from it, we're not necessarily so. I mean, one of the things that did inform my whole interest in the bigger picture of the novel is perhaps my own background. I'm Anglo-Irish and grew up in Australia, but there was always, my childhood was always sort of informed by the Troubles, which is really a euphemism for the brutal civil war in Northern Ireland at that time. And it seems to me that these civil wars can last a generation. So on a large picture, that interested me, and that they're happening around the globe all the time, and yet also within our own families there are these conflicts. And so that was what was sort of behind the notion of the novel, but it was really the characters who were leading the story in their own way, and what they chose to do meant which direction I wanted to sort of carry the story in. Excuse me.
Sure. On a personal level, one of the most thought-provoking aspects of this novel is the relationship between Tessa's brothers Stephen and their parents Lee and Neil. And as a parent, your commentary on this relationship really resonated with me. And it's something I recently discussed with Burr Carroll in relation to her new book, The Missing Pieces of Sophie McCarthy. Yeah. This idea that parents can often be the enablers of their children's less desirable behaviours or attributes. Was this something you deliberately wanted to explore?
I did want to explore the relationships between parents and their adult children, and also that notion of responsibility and control, and how if your child disappoints you, what do you do? Are you responsible for their actions? So all those sorts of themes were questions that were going around in my head when I was considering the relationship between the members of the family.
Yeah. So tell me about the title, The Wolf Hour.
Okay, so The Wolf Hour is generally sort of considered that time, maybe 3 or 4 a.m., you know, when you wake in the middle of the night and perhaps the thing that is troubling you most comes to consciousness. It's when you're considered most awake, when people, you know, it's often sort of said it's the time when people are born or they die. But it's also the time that's sort of considered that when you come face to face with yourself. And it was something that was really interesting me when I was sort of thinking about the novel, that, you know, when you are in a position of you know, a moral dilemma. I mean, do you surprise yourself? Are you the person you thought you were, or are you not? So we were just sort of talking about Neil, the father there before. I mean, he's otherwise a good man, but there's a point at which, you know, everybody can snap. And what is that point? So that was you know, that sort of dilemma for him.
Yeah, because I was going to say, of course, each of them, Tessa, Stephen, Lee, and Neil, all see what they're capable of being or becoming when faced with this ultimate crisis, don't they? I mean,
yes.
Tessa is abducted by rebel forces, and they make a decision to use whatever means necessary to secure her return. And they really do. They reach that point where they have to decide, you know, is this the person I want to be? Is this the person I am? Is this who I thought I was?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And there's also those questions that you ask yourself: are there limits to family loyalty? You know, should you betray a family member? So there are those sort of issues that come up in you know, they're not a sort of an everyday thing, but I think, you know, when most people talk, you know, there's that a wonderful saying that if you think if you think, you know, somebody else's family is normal, you don't really know them well enough. There's always a sort of, you know, the complexities and the depths that are there in people's whole story.
Of course, of course. Now, how much of your experience as a nurse do you think found its way into the narrative for this novel?
I think a lot. I think that you know, once you've, you know, you've sort of had that kind of intimate contact with people and just survival and existence, it's always there. And so it's very much a part of it. So when we were sort of talking about research before, I think that's the second strand of research for me, is the really personal thing. So there's, you know, there's perhaps my nursing, but there's also, you know, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a daughter, a sister. There's all those sort of things that do inform the fabric of how you want to sort of get your characters to sort of sit and make them sort of seem really real and three-dimensional.
Indeed. Now, Sarah, The Wolf Hour is your second novel, and your first, Transplanted, was published some time ago now. I wanted
Yes.
to ask you, have you always wanted to be a writer?
I look, it never really occurred to me when I was growing up. I grew up on a farm, and which then sort of became a rural community quite quickly, because it was out on the eastern corridor of Melbourne. I as you've mentioned, I went nursing, and it was not sort of something that, you know, was considered that I would do. I didn't really have the option to go to university at that sort of stage, although I deeply wanted to. So I fell in love with reading first and foremost. And I can remember actually when that sort of really hit me, being at about, because there weren't that many books in my home, but I can remember my mum had a collection of books, and she did have Sons and Lovers by D.H. Lawrence. And I remember being about 14 or something and taking this book and hopping into bed and reading it from beginning to end in one night, and thinking, and just that sort of immersion into another world, but a world that you can identify with. And even as I'm saying that to you now, I realise there's quite a lot of family politics in in that novel. And then, you know, you go on with life. I did go to uni. I did do literature. I studied literature, but I didn't think that I would necessarily write. I thought I'd perhaps do some reviewing and that sort of thing. And then I just sort of decided, oh, well, you know, on the one hand, it's very easy for people to deconstruct another person's work and to be able to talk from it. And I'm much better at talking about other people's work than my own. But what is it like to actually put one together and and go down that whole path of creation rather than, you know, sort of unpacking it. And I was hooked, really. I just love it. I think that I write in order to understand things. And so, you know, there is that sort of real immersion into your interest and to following it down all sorts of rabbit holes. And sometimes it's completely, you know, you go off on a tangent, and then other times it sort of brings you back to a surprising sort of contrast or gives you greater cohesion in what you want to say. Mm-hmm. And this is the thing. I think writers often sort of say that they're better on the page than what they are when they're discussing things. So I think we like to pick up with the pen.
So what I wanted to ask you is, are you actually working on anything else at the moment?
Yes, I am. I am working on. It's a completely different. I think my interest often with a novel is widely different. So there are two things. There's but I think one is beginning to take precedence. So it's a story actually about a political comedian. So, and it's set mainly in Australia. So it's taking me away from the world of where the Wolf Hour was set. Although I'm still very interested in Africa and African writing, and in fact at the moment I'm doing some mentoring work for the Mawazo Institute, which is a sort of for emerging writers. So I'm hearing lots of contemporary African stories coming. So there's still that interest that's sort of there, and I'm enjoying that very much at the same time.
That's brilliant. So Sarah, if listeners wanted to connect with you or to learn more about your books, where can they find you?
Well, I have a website, so that's sarahmyles.com.au, and on that there's a link to other social media, so Instagram and Twitter and Facebook.
Fantastic.
So that's probably the easiest way.
That's brilliant, Sarah. Now, I've absolutely loved chatting with you today. Thank you so much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thanks, Claudine. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you for your interest. It's lovely to have this opportunity.
Now, listeners, to find out how to win a signed copy of Sarah's gripping book, head on over to my Facebook or my Instagram feed and follow the prompts. Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudineteinellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.